I just actually spoke to two of the priests who'd come out, clerical staff who were on site, either to help people who were wandering in the area, some of the fire crews who had succumbed to exhaustion and heat, needed some talking to, obviously. Some of the scenes that we've been told exist down there, absolutely gruesome, body parts everywhere. The the clergy member who I spoke with earlier told me in no uncertain terms that this is just an unbelievable scene, nothing he's ever seen before, that he would be available as long as he could be, but that the situation was far too unstable at that time for him and another attending doctor to even stay. I just witnessed another priest who is actually an NYPD priest. He had the badge, and I approached him just to the right of me over here and asked him if he could tell me what he had seen, and he just sort of stared at me with blank eyes and said, I just can't speak. It's been the response of a lot of people that we've talked to who have come out of that death zone, the center zone where this all started this morning. Most people pretty despondent. A lot of these people know that their comrades, their colleagues, didn't survive this. One of the more unbelievable stories I heard was from Officer Dominic Kunza, who was standing at this perimeter just up until about 15-20 minutes ago. He's been moved to another perimeter now. Brian, he told me that over his radio earlier today, he was listening as a number of the police officers with whom he works were on the 40th floor screaming for help over the radio of the Second World Trade Tower. And then he heard all the transmissions go blank as the tower came down. And so he knows that 40 of them didn't survive that. That was the second tower. And as you said earlier, a lot of the towers have come down since. I was broadcasting live earlier, interviewing a woman with her baby who was evacuating from one of the apartments nearby. And let's just show you what happened during that interview. Tower number 7 came down. Have a look. Please be careful of your baby. Oh my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way. Please be careful of your baby. This is it.
That's the building coming down.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. No. No. Listen. We'll be all right. We'll be all right.
We're okay. Ashley! I think we're okay. Ashley, I think we're okay.
All right. We're going to have to move this way. We're going to have to move. We're going to have to move. That cloud is coming this way. Yeah. Also attending on the scene have been a number of National Guard, Marines, and also military construction personnel who have arrived in the back of Army trucks rolling down West Broadway. I can also tell you that a number of volunteers have come out. Truckloads of water have been dispersed, not only for the crews who are attending to this, but also victims and press and people who have been on this scene for over 12 to 14 hours now. A lot of people are coming together. There are blood signs, requests for blood donors that are posted on a lot of the street signs all around here. And as I mentioned before, again, there is no water, no electricity, and a complete blackout from here about 10 blocks down, and about 2 to 3, maybe 4 blocks towards the west, and another 2 blocks towards the east as well. And as we continue to watch some of these emergency personnel come in, we have not yet seen any evidence of bodies or of wounded coming through this particular area, but a lot of ambulances have gone back and forth as well. So it's anybody's guess as to whether they've been ferrying people from the scene to triage. Brian.
Ashley Banfield, after a long day in Lower Manhattan, thank you for that. To the south in Washington at the White House, this was supposed to be a pretty average day. The president was on the road but was due back in the afternoon. Average, that is, right up until the Secret Service came in and got the Vice President and First Lady and took them away to a safe place, and then the building was evacuated. NBC News correspondent Bob Kerr was there for all of it, including the evacuation, and is back now tonight and with us. Bob, good evening to you.
Brian, good evening. We are waiting now for the President of the United States on this tragic and important occasion for him and for the country. To address the nation by TV. That address scheduled to happen in about 20 minutes or so. We have some indication of the president's mood. We've had indications that he was angry about this, sharp about it. And in fact, look at some of the comments he made earlier today in a couple of appearances earlier. He said it's a national tragedy. He called them cowardly acts. He said terrorism against the United States cannot stand. And he had a meeting with his National Security Council, National Security Advisors, earlier today about 3:30, 4 o'clock Eastern Time, this while he was still in Nebraska at an Air Force facility. And this quote was put out. This is what he told his National Security Advisors at that hour. He said, "We will find these people and they will suffer the consequences of taking on this nation." He said, "We will do what it takes. No one will diminish the spirit of this country." Now, the president arrived arrived back here just about 7 o'clock tonight. This was supposed to be a night here on the White House lawn where there was to be a barbecue for members of Congress with the president holding court and hosting. Obviously, that is not to be. The situation, though, is one where the White House thought that it was important that the president come back here, come to the White House, the people's house, not show any fear of returning here and speaking to the nation from here. A very important symbolic sign, obviously, with security measures having been taken. We did have a briefing a little while ago, Brian, by a few cabinet officials who told us some of the efforts that the government is undertaking in the wake of this tragedy. For example, various efforts at search and recovery, teams being sent out by the federal government, crime scenes being established. Get this, I want to get it right. Listen to how many crime scenes, federal crime scenes in New York, D.C., Pittsburgh, Boston, Newark, New Jersey. Thousands of FBI officers were told, converging on those areas, treating them as crime scenes. The other thing is that Secretary of Transportation Norm Mineta was here just a short time ago and said the American public, once it gets back to airports and even railroad stations for that matter, will find new and tighter security measures in place in the next several days or as soon as travel resumes in the nation's transportation system. He said, you know, you always weigh freedom against safety in these cases. Now there are going to be some pretty stringent measures. Obviously, some delays are going to result. The theme, if there is one, Brian, here tonight among the cabinet officials who spoke, is that what today represented, in their view, was an attack on freedom. For example, the freedom to travel. They all say this is something that the country will not tolerate. Of course, they say they're going to try to take appropriate action, and they're vowing, really, to take action against the perpetrators of these deeds. The question, of course, as it has been in the past, is whether they can actually be found and targeted. And that is a question that's going to be asked here in the weeks and perhaps months to come.
And Bob Kerr will come back to the White House for the president's remarks exactly 15 minutes from now. Thank you for that from the briefing room. We are joined now by Bill Richardson, former U.S. Secretary of Energy, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN. He is with us tonight from Washington. Mr. Secretary, you've been watching this like all Americans today. Where are your thoughts tonight?
I'm angry, very sad. This is a tragic day. But at the same time, I think it's important what the president has done. We have to rally around the government. I think the president and his cabinet are doing the right thing, setting a tone of healing, but also that we're going to not be overcome by these terrorists. Normalcy will come back soon. But my thought, Brian, besides tragedy for the victims, and I have a close friend that may be in those towers, is that we have to ensure that this never happens again, and whatever it takes, whether it's beefing up our terrorism capability, our human intelligence, our satellite intelligence, that when we find who the perpetrators are, that we strike hard and fast, and those countries that don't participate in helping us would be part of the problem too. So we need an international effort, but I think the president, now's the time to rally around him and his cabinet. As a country, we need to heal and come together and mourn the loss, but then move forward and take the necessary steps so this never happens again.
There was an extraordinary gathering tonight on the steps of the Capitol. The leadership of the House and Senate, Democrat and Republican, on this night and in the days to come. There are no political parties in Washington. It was followed by singing of God Bless America, and it was the kind of thing that would make Americans proud. What does the president need to say tonight to all Americans, in your view?
Well, I think he has to continue this very positive tone that he has set and the leaders of Congress has set. Number one, that we've got to mourn the loss of those that have left us. Number two, that this should never happen again. And number three, to assure the country that he will take the necessary steps, retaliatory action. I suspect he will talk about a military strike once we find the perpetrators. But I think most importantly, he will set a tone of bringing the country together in this day of perhaps the greatest tragedy that has ever fallen this country. And at the same time, Brian, sending a signal to the world and to the terrorists that America is not going to be cowed, that we're unified, that our government is functioning, our airports, our institutions are functioning, and that this attack on America will not be forgotten.
Is America to blame, the intelligence community, for any of this?
Brian, I don't think this is the time to blame, but I think we have to look at some hard facts. Number one, that this attack, these attacks coordinated, pretty well planned, were not detected. We need to find ways to improve our human intelligence so that we can penetrate those terrorism cells. Why is it that the intercepts may not have picked up some of the activity of many of these people that came into the country and planned many of these ventures? I think we also have to ensure that our terrorism capability within the government, let's check and see and make sure that it isn't too diffused, that it isn't too separated. I think we need a national commission of prominent Americans to find out what happened, to make recommendations on what steps need to be made to ensure that our counterterrorism policy domestically and internationally is working well, is properly coordinated, and that we have the necessary resources to beef up our human intelligence, which seems to have been what we needed most to avoid what happened today.
From Washington tonight, Bill Richardson. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for coming on with us.
Thank you.
As we mentioned, the World Trade Center attacked and destroyed. The Pentagon attacked but still standing. And the weapon of choice here by the terrorists were loaded with fuel, commercial jetliners hijacked, and presumably their commercial pilots replaced in the cockpit. We are joined by NBC News correspondent Robert Hager from Washington tonight on what happened to the 4 hijacked aircraft and how. Bob, good evening to you.
Good evening, Brian. Well, as you know, there's now a nationwide hold on all commercial flights. That's the first that we've ever had in the history of the U.S. It lasts at least until midday tomorrow, and it could last longer than that. And tonight, Secretary Mineta, the Transportation Secretary, has said that when flights resume, there will be, expect stringent security, no curbside luggage, random checks of identification, and so on. Meanwhile, some are calling for the first details of what may have been going on in cockpits, some chilling details of that we'll tell you about in a moment, but first, the facts.
The string of events that results in these 4 horrific crashes begins at Boston's Logan Airport, 7:45 a.m. American Flight 11, a 767 with 92 on board, supposed to fly Boston to Los Angeles, but over New York State, it's diverted, forced to fly south, directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A long day of carnage is underway. Back in Boston, United Flight 175, another 767 with 65 aboard, is already in the air, also bound for Los Angeles, 15 minutes behind the first flight, when it too is hijacked. This, the actual plane, as it hits the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 8:10 a.m. American Flight 77, a 757 with 64 aboard, has taken off from Washington's Dulles Airport, also bound for Los Angeles. It, too, taken over and loops back into the Pentagon. It slices in at an angle, leaving a deadly and ugly gash in the nation's military nerve center. And finally, 8 a.m. out of Newark Airport, United's Flight 93, a 757 with 45 aboard, bound Newark to San Francisco, hijacked as well, but crashes short of whatever its intended target is, comes down in rural western Pennsylvania. Eyewitnesses there.
And I heard a loud noise, and I happened to look up, and it was a plane. It was real low to me. It sounded like it was running fine to me. I just kept watching. I watched it go nosedive straight into the ground.
You could see where the plane made the initial impact in the ground, and it was still on fire. It made a crater probably 30 feet by 30 feet, and it's probably 15 or 20 feet deep, and there's just debris scattered within probably a half-a-mile radius.
There are only two ways terrorists can sneak themselves or their weapons aboard planes, either through passenger screening or by going unscreened through locked doors into off-limits areas or onto the tarmac. Periodic FAA tests have found plenty of flaws. Found when government agents tried to sneak into secure areas, they were successful more than 2/3 of the time. Found testers also often able to sneak fake guns and explosives by X-ray screening. Once aboard, many speculate the hijackers must have disabled crews and taken over the plane's controls. More likely that than forcing a pilot with a gun at his head to fly right into the World Trade Center, for instance. Former American Airlines pilot Jim Tillman.
It is inconceivable to me that any airline pilot would allow anyone to force him to fly into an inhabited building. I cannot imagine how any pilot could be conscious or capable of doing anything to control that airplane at the time that it was directed at one of these buildings.
Terrorism specialist Neil Livingstone.
I suspect that what we're going to find is that the pilots were overwhelmed, perhaps dead already, and that trained pilots from the hijacker camp were in charge of those aircraft and were willing to die for their beliefs.
If there was time, if there was, the crews may have been able to press a button in the cockpit and send out a coded warning to controllers that there was a hijack in progress. Controllers may then have radioed back inquiries. But if the crews were disabled, the controllers would have been left in the dark for real information. Whatever else, controllers must have been surprised, in disbelief. There hadn't been a commercial plane hijacked in the U.S. for 10 years, since 1991. And now this.
Meantime, Brian, there's some unconfirmed reports. We spoke about chilling reports of what's been going on in the cockpits, what was at the time. One report from a controller in New Hampshire who says that a pilot in that first flight that was hijacked, the American airliner out of Logan, that the pilot had his finger down on the microphone and would key it in the open position, and that the controller believes he heard one of the hijackers say in English, "Don't do anything foolish," speaking to the pilot. Then the microphone went dead and the transponder went off. That's equipment in the cockpit that sends a signal to radar. So what the controllers would have been left with is able to see the blip as it headed down to New York out of its intended route and toward the World Trade Center, but they would not have been able to tell the altitude because that transponder was off. There are also some cell phone calls from relatives on the plane, one from Barbara Olson, the wife of the Solicitor General Theodore Olson, who was on one of the fatal flights. She called her husband twice before the plane went down, and she said the terrorists had knife-like instruments. There was another relative who got off a call on the cell phone that said in that flight they had been herded in back and the pilot was in back with them, so evidently the terrorists had taken over the controls of the aircraft. One day we may know more about all this if the cockpit voice recorders survived those fiery crashes, because they would have an actual audio recording of just what was being overheard being said in the cockpits. Brian?
Bob, a quick question. Someone said that they chose to hijack 757s and 767s because while the planes aren't identical, one's a wide body, one's a single aisle, they are both by Boeing, both twin engine, and have similar flight decks. Learn how to fly one, you can probably fly the other. Any truth to that?
Well, that is true, that they do indeed have very similar flight decks, and so if you were training terrorists from abroad to take over the controls of these planes, and as we've said, it does appear that they did take over the controls, there might be some advantage in choosing those two models. They also, it's been pointed out, chose all flights that were going to the West Coast, because we had 3 bound for Los Angeles and 1 for San Francisco.
Full of fuel.
So that might be an obvious reason, because they'd be fully loaded with fuel and therefore make a much more explosive kind of bomb as they hit their intended targets.
Robert Hager, Bob, thanks for your superb coverage throughout this day today. Howard Fineman of Newsweek magazine and NBC News with us from Washington tonight. Howard, this president, new in his term, has been handed an unspeakable tragedy, perhaps the largest crisis any president, American president, has faced since FDR. Tell us what you know about how this White House has handled this day no one wanted.
Well, they handled it not by coming directly back to Washington, and that created some concern up on Capitol Hill. After the Hill was evacuated, Brian, about 70 senators met in the Capitol Hill police station a few blocks from the White House. From the Capitol. They met at 5 o'clock this afternoon when it wasn't clear that the president was coming back, let alone that he was going to speak to the nation. And my sources tell me that it was an angry, even tumultuous meeting at times, with both Republicans and Democrats saying the country needs to hear from the president. As it turned out, around that time, the president was preparing to leave Omaha to come back here, but it wasn't until a couple of hours ago that we knew for sure that he was going to address the nation. And everyone I talked to here today and around the country, politicians, big and small, all said that the number one priority for the president is to show himself in command and control in the White House, and to reassure the nation, which of course the president is about to do. But for a few hours this afternoon, there were a lot of concerns, both among Republicans and Democrats, about just where he was and what he was going to say.
Luckily, if I'm allowed a moment of unabashed patriotism, this is a great country, and one of the great things about it is the almost uniquely American urge to rally around the chief executive without regard to party when things get rough for this country. And Howard, have you any reason to believe that won't happen this time?
I'm sure that it will, Brian, and that's the point that the senators were making in private. They wanted him to be literally and figuratively the rallying flag, to show himself, to be the leader, to be the commander-in-chief and the symbol of the country, and to do it visibly and to do it quickly. And that, of course, is what the president is going to do. And I've been around here for now a long time, Brian, and I have never seen a sight or heard one quite like the members of Congress spontaneously on the steps of a Capitol breaking out in song in honor of this country. And that's a deep emotional bond. You saw Senator Trent Lott leaning over to embrace the Democrat Barbara Mikulski. You saw the people spontaneously expressing their love of country and their concern and hope and dedication to the country. And that's the kind of wellspring of emotion that the senators meeting privately today wanted the president to tap, and I think he will tap into tonight. But to call this a defining moment both for him and the country is an understatement. But right now the measurements are not of George Bush per se. They're of the presidency and our ability to come together as a country.
It was an incredible moment on the Hill tonight. The leadership, both parties coming together, followed by an impromptu singing of God Bless America. And to our viewers, we will re-rack that tape and have it for you in the hours as our coverage continues here. And Howard Fineman, I know you're going to be available to us, and thank you for coming on, for your contributions. We are coming up to the bottom of the hour here tonight, which means that in about 2 minutes' time, from the Oval Office, President George W. Bush will address the nation. We know a few things about what is planned here tonight. We know he is scheduled to talk for roughly 4 to 5 minutes, and we know that the planning was to focus mostly on what is the real tragedy across this country tonight, and that is the victims, those who were killed, and unspeakable numbers of victims. There is so much we still don't know tonight about things like the death toll. Let us take just a moment here. We're a minute away from the president and show you what happened on Capitol Hill tonight.
And that I love, stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies, to the ocean, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
That is how it happened tonight on Capitol Hill, an impromptu singing after an emotional moment. The president is waiting for the cue in the Oval Office after a long day. Here now, the President of the United States.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight, I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
President Bush, after an unspeakably horrible day across this country, especially in the metropolitan centers of New York and Washington, where columns of smoke still rise, the president trying to reassure a shaky nation tonight from the Oval Office of the United States with an interesting and pointed comment tonight saying the United States will make no distinction between terrorists who commit these acts and those who harbor them. President choosing his words very carefully. There is no presidential biography or guidebook to guide him. This has never happened to any member of that elite club, any of the men who have served as this nation's chief executive. This is uncharted territory, not only for this president, still in the first year of his term, but for the Americans who were shaken by today's terrorist attacks. We are joined by Chris Matthews, the host of Hardball tonight, and again by Howard Feynman to go over what they just heard and what we have seen here all day long. Chris, again, an unspeakably horrible day. No president ever wants this kind of thing dumped in his lap. This president now has. What next?
Well, it's been compared to Pearl Harbor, and the problem that the president faces is that he doesn't have a clear-cut enemy, as Roosevelt faced after December 7th of 1941, that day of infamy. This time around, they're faceless. He can call them cowards, but they're certainly not cowards, these people who flew those planes into the building, into the Twin Towers. The problem is, where you got to in that language, you go after the people who harbor them as well as the terrorists themselves, but does that bring you into attacking a whole community? For example, the Islamic fundamentalists across the Mideast. Who is your enemy? The people that were cheering today on the West Bank and in Gaza, are they your enemy? Or just the criminals themselves, the ones who did the logistics work, who may have paid the bribes, the ones who came up with the money, are they the enemy? The problem here for this president is, how do you find victory if you can't find the enemy? And if you can't associate, if you can't find the actual enemy, do you go off and just bomb some people who are associated with them, those who harbor them? And then the world will say, you're wagging the dog. You're going after people who may not have committed any criminal act simply because you disagree with their politics. It's a very tough conundrum for this president. It was easier for Roosevelt. He simply had to send the U.S. Navy and the military forces to regain those islands in the Pacific and island hop their way back to the home islands of Japan. This time around, that route is not so clear.
Chris, it was said earlier today that when you get away from the horrific initial sadness, the fact that there are families in New York and Washington and elsewhere with an empty place at the dinner table tonight, when you get over that, the worst part of this is how well it was organized, right. How someone was able to plan this down to the minute under everyone's nose.
And the use of the weaponry, perhaps it's knives, we've heard, that were used to subdue the air stewards and to reach the pilots and to take control of the planes. You know, there's a person missing from our table tonight, and that's Barbara Olson, who's been on our programs, yours and mine, so many times. And she was on one of those planes that was, God, imagine her last moments. It was unbelievable in personal terms. But I think this president has a lot to stand up to. He has to find a mission for the American people. This is not going to be a good detective story for us to find out who the actual people are who did this. I think the American people want a larger role, and I think this president has to find it for them. So far, they're giving blood, and the members of both houses from both parties are singing together. But I think the American people are much more muscular people than that, and they'll want to know what they should do about this. And they can't go to the recruiting stands. So what do they do? And I think that's another problem for this president. He has to find a way to unleash the American spirit to get these people. And that could be a larger target or a smaller target. But my hunch is, based upon his words tonight, and I think you heard them the way I did, it's going to be a larger target. It's not just going to be the guys who drew up the logistics. It's going to be the people behind them, as the president put it.
That's certainly what I heard. And Howard, as Chris referenced, back in '41, the American anger, you could see it in the lines of young men lining up in Times Square who were elbowing each other out of the way for the honor of signing up first to volunteer to go get them. How will that anger manifest itself this time against a so far unknown enemy?
Well, this is a different world and a different war, Brian, and this is a war of terrorism that's ongoing, that's part of the environment, that's part of our very lives. The question for the president is how to focus it. I think it'll be focused by what our armed forces do. And I was told this evening that several senators have been briefed by high government officials on what they know. And what they know is they feel they have a pretty good idea, not 100%, but a pretty good idea, at least as of 7 or 8 o'clock tonight, as to who the perpetrators are, where they are, and who's harboring them. So I think the way the American people will express their anger and their focus is through the men and women of the military. And I think that's going to happen sooner rather than later. I thought perhaps the president would be more specific tonight, but I think he wants to be 100% sure that he knows the targets that he's facing and he knows the countries or peoples that are harboring these terrorists. And I think that's the next thing to happen. One other thing I'd like to mention, Brian, I just got a call from Karl Rove, the political advisor and close friend of the president. He says that there were indeed credible security threats and concerns that kept the president out of Washington, D.C. until late this afternoon. But that in fact the president and his entourage had decided by about 1 o'clock, I think Central Time, to begin heading back. Ironically, that meeting I told you about earlier, where the members of the Senate were concerned about the president's whereabouts, was taking place after, according to Rove, the president had decided to return. But I wanted to underline what he said to me, which is that there were indeed what they and security people felt were credible threats against the President of the United States that kept him out of the airspace and the ground here inside the District of Columbia.
That had been our hunch in the late afternoon.
Well, that's the hunch, but he's saying it on the record,
right.
And I think that's crucial.
Right, it is, and it's also rare for...
That's part of the damage, Brian. Part of the damage here is the President of the United States was kept from his capital. This may be the first time since James Madison, an American president, has had to make clear of the capital. And it's serious business. I think it's going to hurt the country's self-image to know that its president couldn't come to the White House, couldn't come to Washington. I think it's part of the damage today.
Remember, there was the time in '63 when there was some debate over whether or not to bring LBJ back, and they decided to make a statement by flying back home that night, as George W. Bush did today. As we've been talking, Chris, we've looked at the first tape pictures coming in of the damage at the Pentagon. It's the first up-close view we've gotten today. Chris, how many times today have you kind of stopped yourself after this nonstop coverage and said, my God, they got the Pentagon?
Well, yeah, because you're making the statement in the question, which is this is the most secure target in the country. This is the most difficult to reach spot. And what we've learned today is if you can hijack a plane, you can get anywhere in the States. They could have gone after the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Liberty Bell. They could have gone after the White House. What would have stopped them today? I think that's another question. I think we're going to live in a state which has much less freedom than we had before today. The president said we're fighting for freedom against the enemies of freedom. But the fact is, we've already seen we've lost freedom. You or I can't drive by the White House anymore and wave or honk our horns like we used to do in the old days. The American people don't have that freedom to go to the Capitol. When I first came to Washington, any American, anybody in the world could walk up to their congressman and to their office and say hi without going through any kind of metal detectors or x-rays or anything. Today, it's like going from East and West Berlin. We have lost our freedom because of these terrorists.
Howard Feynman, the American people have such an enormous potential well of goodwill, especially during times like this. They are ready to envelop George W. Bush. They would envelop whoever the chief executive was right now, and I guess the next 24 hours where the feelings of the kind of the frayed nerves of the American people really become crucial.
Well, and I think that's a job that the president has, in addition to commander-in-chief. There's a royal, almost, aspect to being president, a symbolic aspect. The president has to be visible. He has to be willing to be embraced emotionally. He has to be willing to tap into the deep wells of collective emotion that we have in this democracy. That's what Bill Clinton, for all his faults, was very good at, and what he did so well after the Oklahoma City bombing. George Bush is not a man who likes spectacle. He's actually, in many surprising ways, a private man. But he's got to make himself public. He's got to be seen. He's got to be understood, and he's got to be looked at and identified with by the American people. And I think there are people around him, Karl Rove among them, who are telling him just that. A 5-minute, eloquent, short speech, firm in its resolve, with references to God and the Bible, are great. But that's just the beginning of the emotional involvement the president has to have as a leader in what is essentially a new kind of wartime in this country.
Howard Feynman, Chris Matthews, gentlemen, tough night. Thank you very much for coming on. As I mentioned, we've been watching these first close-up views of the Pentagon. These pictures obviously taken earlier today. This fresh video from later this afternoon, that control tower looking item in the foreground actually is. This happened right near the helipad there on that side of the Pentagon. No one thought it was unusual to hear aircraft noise per se. say on that side of the building, but then to realize it was a passenger jet aircraft of its enormous size, then to realize what had happened was a different thing entirely. Veteran NBC News correspondent John Palmer is there at the Pentagon for us tonight. John, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Hundreds of firefighters are now in the 11th hour of their battle to try to contain this blaze at the west side of the Pentagon, where the hijacked jetliner crashed into the side of the building at about 9:30 this morning. You could look over my shoulder here and see a couple of fires. Blazes have broken through the roof of the Pentagon. From time to time, for the last 4 or 5 hours, we have seen these flares. The plane hit the outer ring. There are 5 rings at the Pentagon, and it penetrated 3 of those. And Governor Jim Gilmore of Virginia was here just a short time ago. He said that he has been to that spot, and he said it is now penetrated into the 4th ring. So it's very difficult, as you can imagine. It's not just one building. These are separated rings, and the fires have moved into 3 and 4 of those rings. There are 5 altogether. The governor had something very interesting to say, in that when he went over there, he said, I was looking for the pit, for the hole, for the depression in the ground where that American airliner went down. But he said there was no depression in the ground. The plane went right into the side of the building. And he said there was a fire hydrant right in front by the helicopter pad, right where the plane went down. And he said it was still standing, untouched. So the plane never hit the ground. On the fly, it went right into the building. And just over to the left, we could see earlier today, you can't see him tonight because it's dark, but there was a tree with all of the leaves and branches sheared off squarely at the top, showing that the plane was coming in quite low at about 1,000 feet, and then it banked and crashed right into the side of the Pentagon there. Most of the people inside the Pentagon were, like many Americans, glued to their television sets, watching the unfolding tragedy there of the World Trade Centers in New York City. And then they heard a crash, a thud, smoke filled the hallways of the Pentagon. A general alarm was sounded, and then everybody fled the building and went out into the parking lots. And the Secretary of Defense himself was in his office, and as he explained earlier tonight, he immediately went to the other side of the Pentagon and indeed took part personally in trying to help some of those people who had been so badly burned. As far as casualties are concerned, the Pentagon is giving no figures tonight whatsoever. The Secretary of Defense, though, did say that the number of casualties is going to be high. The number, he said, will not be a few. And he mentioned, of course, the jetliner with those people aboard had no chance whatsoever. They're trying to wet down the areas now that have been contained. It's terribly hot in there still. They have search dogs, cadaver dogs. Many volunteers and rescue units now are going through the debris, searching, hoping to find somebody alive. But certainly scores have died, scores have been injured here. The building bathed in searchlights tonight, and the search and the rescue will go on throughout the night and well into tomorrow for sure. Brian?
It's a sad night at the Department of Defense and the venerable Pentagon building just over the line in Virginia. And John Palmer, thank you very much for that. She has done an extraordinary job covering this story all during this day from Lower Manhattan. And we are going back to Ashley Banfield now by telephone. I understand she's in an NYPD police cruiser because she's heading into where the central damage is. Ashley, can you hear us?
Yeah, Brian, I'm in the back of one of the NYPD vehicles, and we've just been driving through the inside the perimeter. We've driven to within a block of the demolition site of the second World Trade Tower. There were only 2 stories of rubble that were visible. I don't know how to describe this to you, but if I could say it was like driving through a movie set, that might be the only description that might be fitting at this point. It's pitch black, save for the spotlights that are everywhere. It's completely white. Everything's covered in ash, and there are thousands of emergency response teams milling about, fire, police, EMT from every state that's in the near vicinity and every county. It's really just sort of a frightening and ghoulish sight seeing them. We saw a number of them sort of sitting down trying to get rest. I witnessed about 10 firefighters going back into the periphery after they'd only had an hour respite. They said that they'd had a chance to cool down, to eat, and that they were going back and that it would be a long night. We've also seen about 60 dump trucks all lined up, ready to cart away debris, and about 24 semis as well are going to help in carting away a lot of this debris as well. The emergency level is so severe that even the police vehicle we're in, which is clearly marked, was turned away from getting any closer than a block and a half from the actual, ground zero site. But I would like to say this, that the intelligence department of the NYPD is now feverishly searching for any video that any tourist might have been taking pre-explosion, pre-air disaster, pre-any of this. They want faces. They want people who are in the area of the World Trade Towers. They want anything that was shot before 9 o'clock Eastern, before all of this happened, and for obvious reasons. Their investigation is now going to move towards the people who are in the area, the faces, hopefully in effort to identify who might have been involved in this. And if there's anybody who's listening to this report, I'm in the back of the cruiser now, they're asking please to call the NYPD. And there's actually a number. It's 212-577-TIPS. 212-577-TIPS. If anyone shot any video pre-explosions, pre-disaster, anything from 7:30 this morning on, any tourists who might have been in the area. I also want to just let you know that there are a number of mounted patrols who are on location as well. They're trying to do crowd control, although crowds have mostly dispersed now. But that scene that I just went through in the back of this cruiser is like nothing I've ever seen before. Everything's blanketed in white ash. Every vehicle is blanketed in white ash. And it seems like mayhem, and I don't know if it's controlled mayhem or not, but it is clearly still an emergency. All of the fires seem to be put out. But as I said, I'm right in the middle of that, and pitch dark, except for the glow of some of the firefighters who were walking by. They're clearly exhausted. Many of them had sort of collapsed on location where they were working and had to be doused with water. The heat was just intense from the reports that were coming into us from Ground Zero. Obviously, many of them were working with the understanding that they've lost hundreds and maybe thousands of their colleagues in these disasters. I know that an officer I spoke with earlier heard on his radio while he was doing crowd control from the 40th floor of Tower 2, his fellow officers calling for help, screaming for help as the tower came down, and he knew that none of them had survived. And so many of them are despondent and trying very hard to do the jobs that they're sent here to do, knowing full well that several hundred of their friends and colleagues are dead and are lying in the tomb, which they're in right now. There are dogs on the scene as well, obviously. As far as bodies are concerned, pretty tough guess as to what they've been able to find at this point. I know from some of the on-site reports from officers who I've spoken with, it was absolutely grisly. There were body parts, there were arms, there were legs, there were heads strewn all about that site. But probably some of the most work will come tomorrow in daylight. And those bulldozers that we've been seeing, the construction vehicles that have been pouring into this site, will start the work of trying to remove that rubble. If I can just explain again, the view out of this cruiser at Ground Zero of Tower 2, which is the north tower of the World Trade Center, it was only 2 stories high, and it was just of metal and debris. There was nothing left except for a mound of debris, and it was only 2 stories of it. It's just absolutely remarkable what that was diminished to, those 2 towers.
And Ashley, tonight we should tell you the updated numbers. 200 New York City firefighters feared dead, 78 New York City police officers missing, listed only as missing. There are a lot of anxious families that contain a New York City police officer or a firefighter. A day of just superb and emotional coverage for our own Ashley Banfield today, who is now driving out of the center of the damage district in Lower Lower Manhattan. Also in Lower Manhattan, St. Vincent's Hospital, Greenwich Village, was a scene of much of the activity. Triage, as they call assessing the wounded, the drive to get blood donations. NBC News Chief Science Correspondent Robert Bazell has been on station there for a good deal of time. Bob, good evening to you. What can you report?
Well, Brian, right now the number of casualties at this hospital, which is the closest trauma center to the World Trade Center, stands at more than 300. And of those, about 50 are in critical condition, and significantly, following up on what you were talking with Ashley, more than 45 of those injured are firefighters or police officers or emergency workers of other kinds. That proportion is held out throughout the day. That number, there's another maybe 200 or 300 people at Bellevue Hospital across the town. And the triage that has been taking place down in, a few miles south of me in the World Trade Center area, in the Battery Park City and in other parts of the nearby the World Trade Center. So we haven't seen dead bodies coming up here. When I came here first thing this morning, some of the ambulances were bringing in people who had expired in the ambulance. Since then, they set up triage centers. The dead are being kept in a morgue, which I understand is near the Staten Island Ferry Terminal. The most critically injured are then brought up. The thing about the numbers is 300 here, 200 at another hospital, 100 here and there. They add up, as far as we can tell, to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 injured right now. That's not a lot. There's still a lot of people who are either dead or buried in that rubble. As you can see behind me, there's hundreds of doctors and nurses from St. Vincent's Hospital who are standing outside waiting for each ambulance to come in. One does come in every few minutes, but everybody thinks that this process of waiting for injured survivors is going to go on for many days to come. Brian?
Bob, they have to still be very, very gingerly around the wreckage. It is still settling. They can still hear people inside the wreckage, and that is just going to be the most painful part of this. The next 24 to maybe 72 hours become so crucial.
Absolutely. And even now, when the people who are brought in, it's not one kind of injury. There's smoke inhalation. Mm-hmm. There's an enormous number of severe burns from the blast. A lot of people who have multiple fractures from the debris. So they've had a call at this hospital. They needed more burn specialists and plastic surgeons. People responded. Everybody on the hospital staff here who even heard about the incident came here within minutes, and they've been lined up all day doing a terrific job. This happens to be a Catholic hospital. The Cardinal Egan was here giving last rites and giving his blessings to people. So this has been a center of a lot of activity, which doesn't show any signs of abating.
Robert Bazell in Lower Manhattan for us today, the scene of so much of this activity, and it's important to repeat that maybe for a 30-block area down there, just normal apartment life in New York City tonight is impossible. There are no utilities for the most part for a huge swath of the city. No power. Steam is out to a lot of businesses. There, in some cases, is no water. Gas has been shut off. There was a huge threat of a major gas leak there earlier today. Part of the city of New York is paralyzed, in plain English tonight, ripped apart earlier today with this terrorist attack, and the World Trade Center is gone from the skyline tonight. As we come up now, it is 9 p.m. on the East Coast, and we are coming off this awful day in American history. We have the very latest for you now. The president, speaking just a half hour ago from the Oval Office, says justice will be done, but some would say, most notably in his remarks, quote, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who commit these acts and those who harbor them," was the president sending a pointed, specific message tonight. The president also warned that the death toll will be, as many Americans feared, in the thousands. Just in New York, there's a fear that 200 firefighters are gone. In fact, entire companies of firefighters may be gone. And the president says the government, for the most part, will be open and ready for business tomorrow. While trading will not happen on Wall Street, the president says some emergency staffs are coming to work tonight and that most federal services will be up and running tomorrow. We thought we would show you what today looked like and sounded like from the earliest reports of trouble.
There's another one. I'm taking a look.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision.
Went straight into one of the Twin Towers. It just disintegrated instantly. It was the most awful thing I've ever seen.
It straightened itself out and dove to the other side and crashed right in. An explosion was so terrific it looked like it had dynamite in it.
This is what is coming over our radio. Get out of the area. The second tower is coming down.
They tell you the second tower is coming?
Yes, it's about to collapse.
I got fellow officers that might be trapped. Not trying to be a hero, but I think if you were in this position, you'd do the same thing.
There were people falling out of the sky. We were trying to get people away when the second collapse occurred, and I dove under a truck, so I don't know how I'm here.
I spent a year in combat. I never saw anything like this.
After the first tower collapse, we were back in there trying to bring people out. We knew the second one was about to come down, but we were lifting one person, and when it came down, we all just ran for our lives.
You could hear the rumbling. When you looked up, you could see the top of the building just crumbling. We all headed south, and you could feel the wind hitting in the back. Because as the debris hit.
Couldn't see, everything was totally black. We were just walking, hoping to find daylight. It was just unbelievable. I never seen anything like it in my life.
I'm just thinking about the firemen I see going up the stairs behind me and look at half of this building. I don't know.
It was a hideous scene. There were comparisons to Mount St. Helens in every area but the death toll, which is growing steadily tonight. No one even hazarding a guess about a number. And there you see Lower Manhattan tonight, missing a landmark, a monument of sorts to some. The Twin Towers are gone. They are down. The light you see, floodlights helping with the rescue effort. Most of the fires, we're told, have been put out, but the plume of smoke continues from the barely extinguished blazes and from the dust of the construction that came down earlier today. As I mentioned, we heard from the president tonight 33 minutes ago in the Oval Office. Mr. Bush, after a long day, there were stretches today when we did not know for sure where the president was, and that's exactly the way the White House wanted it for security reasons. Bob Kerr at the White House tonight watched along with us as the president addressed the nation. Bob, good evening.
Brian, you said it yourself earlier that this is a challenge, would be a challenge to any president. This, of course, a relatively new president, less than a year in office. The president, we're told, was able to watch some of those horrible pictures you just showed as he flew today, first from Florida to a military facility in Louisiana, and then from the military facility in Louisiana on to Nebraska. We weren't sure whether the president was going to come back here to deliver his speech to the nation at the White House tonight, but the president and his aides thought it would be a very important symbol for him to return here, and so ultimately that is what was decided. The president in his remarks talked about it being an attack on the very essence of freedom in this country. Let's hear a little bit of what he said earlier.
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining.
The president, in his remarks, went on to say, Brian, as you have pointed out, in a very sharp comment, he said, we will make no distinction between terrorists and those who harbor them. But we did have a briefing just before the president went on the air from his spokesperson, Ari Fleischer. And Ari Fleischer said that this is not a night to talk about targets and the perpetrators of these deeds. There is information here and within the government about that. They didn't want to get into it tonight. Another question was raised. Someone said to Ari Fleischer, look, a lot of people in this country are very, very angry. What about the president? What can you tell us about his mood? Ari Fleischer said the president all day. Very even-keeled, but a steely demeanor is how Ari Fleischer put it. A steely demeanor, resolute. Did not use the word anger, but he said that he had very tough words in private for those who committed these deeds. Brian, back to you.
All right, Bob Kerr from the White House tonight. Thank you. We should point out that it was Howard Feynman who reported on our air this evening a call he received from Karl Rove, one of the president's senior men, who went ahead and disclosed the president was under numerous threats today, and that is the reason that he was kept from Washington for quite some time. For a time there, the American people saw Karen Hughes telling them that government was up and running and trying to calm people while the president was out at an Air Force base in the Midwest. Then the decision was made, which pleased a lot of senators on the Hill, Republicans among them, to bring the president back and that he would talk to the American people tonight, as he did. NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell covering this story along with us all day long, with us tonight from our Washington bureau. Andrea, good evening to you.
Good evening. Tonight, as you know, U.S. officials are mobilizing worldwide the huge intelligence network, trying to find the culprits of this dastardly act and also trying to make sure that the terrorists do not strike again. An attack on America coordinated with military precision, 4 planes, split-second timing, penetration of airports and airspace, no warning.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
The first question tonight, is it over? The terrible answer, despite billions spent on U.S. intelligence, the nation's top experts do not know where or when terrorists will strike next.
The problem is that they are hard to penetrate. They are located in places that we're very hard-pressed to get any kind of information out of. And as hard as our agencies have tried, they've had some success. You don't hear about that. We only hear about the failure.
Who could have done this? Before today, the worst failure, the attack on 2 U.S. embassies in Africa 3 years ago. Again, perfectly timed, no warning, 224 dead. The alleged mastermind, America's most wanted terrorist, Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden also involved, U.S. officials say, in helping the man convicted of bombing the World Trade Center, Ramzi Youssef, 9 years ago, by protecting Youssef before and after that attack. Last winter, CIA Director George Tenet told Congress that bin Laden is capable of multiple attacks with little or no warning.
Osama bin Laden and his global network of lieutenants and associates remain the most immediate and serious threat.
Bin Laden's alleged millennium plots planned attacks on 3 tourist areas in Jordan frequented by Americans, on Los Angeles International Airport, and on a U.S. destroyer in Yemen, all foiled. But 6 months later, terrorists do strike successfully, ram another destroyer, the USS Cole, killing 17. In June, bin Laden brags on this home video of killing U.S. sailors, a remarkable tape made to recruit more terrorists against America. And just 3 weeks ago, a warning to a London newspaper, allegedly from bin Laden's group, that he was targeting America again.
I think it is a dilemma for the United States now. I believe the only thing is, to revise their policies, to look at what's happening. Why, for example, the anti-American sentiment is very high in the Middle East and in the Muslim world.
How could this happen? Only from a massive intelligence failure. But in this case, at least there will be some evidence.
The good news is that the hijacking 4 airplanes is a very complicated operation. Even hijacking 1 is complicated. And they will have left some trail behind them. They will have had to have checked in, they will have had to have purchased tickets either under their name or alias names.
If the U.S. cracks the case, how will it retaliate? Current and former officials say massively, but carefully.
If we're going to act, we need to be able to convince the world that we were justified in our actions. We had that evidence during the African embassy bombings, and I think it's critical that the intelligence community now begin to develop that with respect to these attacks.
Now, today, the Taliban leaders of Afghanistan denied that bin Laden, forgive me, Brian, I've had a bad cold. We've been talking a lot today, but they denied that bin Laden had anything at all to do with this. But you heard George Bush say tonight that they will make no distinction between those responsible for the attack and those who harbor them. And that is the clear message to the Taliban. It's a message that was delivered to them within the last couple of weeks by U.S. officials, that they will be retaliated against if they can pin an attack like this on bin Laden. And so if the evidence is developed, that's exactly what's going to happen. And we are told that at least some members of the Senate have been briefed on intelligence intercepts, electronic intercepts, by members of bin Laden's group, acknowledging that targets have been hit after the fact, and that one of the members of his group was apparently or possibly on one of the 4 doomed airliners. So there are leads tonight.
And Andrea, I heard somebody say earlier, think of all the hearings on the Hill on intelligence and all the blacked out items and all the budgets where no one can know what the money's being spent on. Think of all the people who've been forced to show a money clip at the airport X-ray machines. And today in this country, we had 4 commercial jetliners hijacked and all aboard, presumably dead tonight. It's incredible.
Brian, it is incredible, and that's why the suspicion immediately was on bin Laden, because of his ability to have pulled off, according to all of the evidence in the court case, pulled off the simultaneous attacks on the 2 embassies in Africa in 1998. That kind of coordination requires money and planning, and he is one of the few people around the world, one of the few independent operators believed capable of that. This is not likely state-sponsored terrorism, according to most officials. It is more likely to be someone like bin Laden, one of these freelance operators who have networks and connections with other terror groups around the world.
Very interesting. Andrea Mitchell, thank you for your day's reporting from the Washington Bureau on this horrible day across this country. To talk more on this subject matter, we're joined tonight by Larry Johnson, former Deputy Director of the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism, obviously an expert in this field. He is with us from Washington tonight. Larry, good evening to you. Thank you for coming in.
Good evening, Brian.
I heard another gentleman earlier this evening, an expert on arms control, security, terrorism, say that it was his belief that this could very well be state-sponsored terrorism because of precision aspects of it. Things like timing and how much thinking through they did. The notion of using a commercial aircraft as, in effect, a flying bomb. Who was going to get nervous, for example, with Washington National Airport so nearby to see a jet near the Pentagon? Happens every day.
Right. Well, I was at National actually when the plane went into the Pentagon, so I had sort of a front row seat for it. Look, I understand that there is intelligence information that was available within the previous months indicating that Osama bin Laden's people were receiving flight training in aviation operations.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not kidding.
Where'd that come from?
I can't go into that.
They received flight training, so for example, if the theory is true that they chose deliberately 757s and 767s, even though they're vastly different aircraft, they have the same manufacturer and almost the same flight deck. It is said kind of loosely that if you can fly one, it's not too much of a challenge to fly the other. So with that as their premise, they went out, sought and received flight training, and how many did that not ring alarms throughout the system?
No, because understandably, it'd be one thing if it said they're taking flight training because they're going to fly into the World Trade Center. You get these bits and pieces, and putting the puzzle together is very difficult. But On the issue of state sponsorship, we do already have a state sponsor for bin Laden. It's called Afghanistan. They are they're like the Marriott guest inns for terrorism right now. They allow him to stay there. They claim that they have control over him. And I think President Bush was sending a very clear message. This is not just a reflexive, let's make bin Laden the enemy of the day. The fact of the matter is we already have evidence from trial. It's not alleged, it's proven that he was involved with the bombing of the U.S. embassies in Africa. With that said, we don't have any other terrorist group in the world that's been calling for killing Americans other than bin Laden. Second point, you look back over the last 20 years, there are 2 individuals that have killed 80% of all Americans that have died in international terrorism before today. One of those individuals, Imad Mughniya, security chief of Hezbollah. The other individual, Osama bin Laden. Those 2 individuals were meeting in 1993. That evidence also came out in the bombing trial. So, I think what we're looking at here is this is not speculation. The targets are very real. The targets are very specific in terms of who is causing these problems. And I think that's what President Bush intends to address.
This was such a sad day in this country. Americans found out that this really hurts. This is a dangerous game. We've now seen how these guys play. Given that we don't allow state-sponsored assassination, how do we play back?
Well, I think we need to wake up and figure out which game we're in. We are like people that want to kill rats, but we don't want to go into the sewers. We want to stay out of the sewers. We don't want to get dirty. We want to be antiseptically clean. But unfortunately, our intelligence apparatus has been set up to collect information against a traditional state, in that case, the Soviet Union. Penetrating these groups is not like going in and penetrating a monastery and recruiting Mother Teresa to work for us. Consequently, again, this is not to pin blame on the intelligence community, but I have many friends and I talk to associates that the operation has become so bureaucratized, so hampered in part by political correctness, that it is an ineffective institution right now. And this isn't the first instance where we've been caught unawares. Every major terrorist incident going back into the mid-1980s has occurred without advanced warning. And one of the problems is it has not really been the ultimate intelligence priority to go after and penetrate these groups.
Larry Johnson, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thanks,
are
Brian.
going to bring up another expert in this field, a man who approaches this from several different angles. He has been a pilot, he has been a United States Senator, and spends a good deal of his modern adult life thinking about these issues. Warren Rudman is with us by telephone. Senator, good evening to you.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, sir. First of all, I'm just curious, having watched this along with us, such a sad day across this country, how you must feel about this tonight.
Well, I, of course, share everyone's sadness and shock, but I must tell you that when I heard about it this morning, when I was
chairs, we even saw airplane chairs, over the place. That was
really?
Official, yes. Glass buildings 7-8 blocks away, smashed. It's devastation, completely.
And have you seen any bodies?
Not yet, we haven't. We're waiting for everybody else, wait for coordination to get together, all the federal authorities, also state authorities, and then we'll join a team then.
And what's your role?
I am actually, we are tunnelers, really. We will go through the debris, small cracks, anything what we can do.
Why do you do this?
It's what we do.
You've worked lots of things, nothing comparable to this, naturally.
No, nothing. I've never experienced something like this before.
How long do you think this is going to take to go through?
A long time. There's a lot of work to be done. A lot of work to be done.
Thank you very much for speaking with us. We'll be in touch again.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
All right.
Back to the New York Bureau and Tim Cavanaugh, who works about a quarter-mile away from the World Trade Center. As we understand it, Tim, you were on the phone?
Actually, my friend's brother was on the line with him, and they got cut off immediately. And then I was on a conversation with his brother, and he told me that his brother had heard the first crash, and he was informing his brother of what had happened. And then all of a sudden the phone got cut off from him, and that was the last he's heard of his brother since. I brought his pictures so that maybe if there's someone out there who can see him, who has seen him, or if he's in a hospital somewhere, maybe someone can call and let him.
Can we see it?
Sure.
Where's the picture?
It's right here in my hand.
Want to hold it up? Okay, so we get a close-up of this. And he worked in the building?
He worked for Cantor Fitzgerald on the 102nd floor. It's a guy I coach football with. I've known him my whole life. He's a great man.
You are probably resorting to prayer.
Actually, I walked from my office, which is a quarter-mile away, and it was desolate. It was like a nuclear bomb had gone off, and there were ashes, like, in the street, like about 1 foot to 6 inches of ashes, if you could imagine that, walking down the street. And I walked over to Our Lady of Victory Church, which is right down the street from Wall Street. And Wall Street, usually they have the barricades there, and there was nothing. It was gone. And, you know, I picked up a piece of paper, and I saw the paper and read it, and it was from the 106th floor of the World Trade Center, and I just knew that it was, you know, you couldn't imagine it. It was like being in downtown Beirut in America.
Good grief. And on the scene is Rose Arce. Rose is a CNN producer in New York, a veteran CNN producer, and a very capable CNN producer. Where were you when this happened this morning, Rose? I can't hear Rose. Okay. I'm sorry, Rose. Okay. We'll have to check back with you, Rose. We're having difficulty. Let's go to Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. Jamie, first, we've heard the briefings earlier. What kind of shape is that building in?
Pretty bad shape, Larry. It's nearly 12 hours after this plane slammed into the side of the Pentagon. The building is still burning. The firefighters say they have the blaze contained in an area, but it's still not under control. In fact, if you look right behind my head, you can see some flames licking out of the roof there. That's part of the firefighting technique of trying to cut the roof open and let the fire burn through in order to put this out. Nevertheless, the Pentagon is vowing, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld and President Bush both saying that the building will open for business as usual tomorrow. That may be possible if they just open the other side of the building, where, of course, the Secretary's office is, the Pentagon briefing room, the National Military Command Center, all on the other side of the building. You know, in some ways, there was a little bit of luck in today's incident in that this part of the building was under renovation. That meant that some of the new space that had just been renovated was not yet occupied, and it also had improved fire retardant capabilities. And on the old side, over basically in this direction, that part of the building, people had just moved out to get ready for the next phase of renovation. So there weren't nearly as many people as might have been in the building at that time of day. Nevertheless, Pentagon officials expect the death toll to be high, but they are not saying publicly what they think that death toll will be. Larry?
And Jamie, have you been able at all to see the aircraft?
Well, you know, earlier today I got right up next to the building and I took a look at some of the pieces that were outside. There were only very small pieces of that American Airlines jetliner, a cockpit that was a window that was all smashed, part of the fuselage that was bent and twisted. But most of the parts of the plane are still inside the building, according to people who have been in and seen it.
Thank you, Jamie. Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. We have a panel of senators joining us, and before we check with them, here is just a moment of what the statement made tonight by President George Bush at the White House. Watch.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved.
This country, right at this instant, there's a group of people that in fact gave the necessary support to these terrorists who committed the acts today that they committed. And so you have to go at them at every level.
Of what's on DirecTV.
I wasn't surprised that it was able to withstand that impact with a hole in the side without collapsing. When I saw the second plane go in, I was just shocked because I didn't realize if the first one was an accident but when the second plane went in, I knew somebody was doing something.
So give me a play-by-play of what you think was going on in the building and why it came down.
Right. The planes itself hit and they put holes in the side of the columns on the side of the building, but the impact of the planes did not bring the building down. And they stood for over an hour. The fire from the jet fuel, that's what created tremendous temperatures. The steel, when it gets up to about 1,500, 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, it will bend. It loses its strength. And when the temperatures of the steel got to that level, then there was the serious trouble.
So the planes actually kind of wiped out this sprinkler system, which would have put out the fire, right?
Well, even the sprinkler systems, even if they had been intact, they delivered water. And a jet fuel fire needs foam. Like when you see incidents at airports, they always put foam all over the planes to extinguish the jet fuel fire. So even if the sprinkler system had been working, it probably wouldn't have been able to put out that kind of a fire with that much jet fuel. They're just not designed for that kind of
hazard. So the steel heats up and it weakens the building, and then obviously the building came down, looks like it came straight down on top of itself. Now, why did that happen?
Well, from everything we can see from the videotapes on television, basically it looks like the upper floors that were supported by the area that was on fire, that the steel lost its strength, and then the weight of those floors came down and one by one crushed each of the floors due to the weight of the building above, and it just progressively collapsed down.
Now, you were telling me earlier that this building actually is built better than many of the buildings that are built right now, with several redundancies, and this actually maybe stood up longer than it should have.
Right. Actually, a lot of buildings would not have survived the initial impact from those airplanes. The fact that the columns on this building was, on each of these towers, they were very closely spaced. They were just a little bit over 3 feet apart. There was a column every 3 feet around the exterior. That gave tremendous redundancy and allowed the building to stand for an hour with a big hole in its side.
Now, there was some speculation, there was a reason, maybe why, maybe they knew why, the planes hit high on the building rather than lower. Now, was that building more vulnerable for a high hit by an airplane versus a low hit?
I suspect it was just that they hit where they could without, they didn't want to hit any other buildings until they hit the World Trade Center. I would hope that they didn't have any special knowledge or that they weren't trying to do anything specifically in mind for that. So.
Well, John Magnuson, thank you very much for joining us here on Tech Live. I think that's very fascinating. We hear there's a firm that actually built the structural engineering, put the structural engineering together for the World Trade Center, and it was the fire, not so much the plane crash, that brought the buildings down. Back to you guys in the studio.
Matt Markovich up in Seattle. Thank you so much, Matt. We are going to take a break, but up next, the latest on rescue efforts to find those trapped in the rubble of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon when Tech Live continues.
In Gateway Country, we know some folks hold off on buying new technology until the price comes.
Reaction, no, I've never encountered this type of slowdown.
It was a similar scene as some of the other major crossings. The Windsor-Detroit Tunnel was shut down for about 5 hours. And on the Ambassador Bridge, massive backups. At Niagara Falls, no complaints about the slow traffic, but outrage from Americans over the attacks.
Whoever did it, I hope they really get the crap knocked out of them. I mean, they will, as the Americans stand together. It's a sad day for America. I'm still proud to be an American, but we need to straighten this out real quick and go after the parties. All-out war, that's what it is, just like Pearl Harbor.
At this hour, the Peace Arch Crossing, about a 45-minute drive from Vancouver, it is very quiet. It is, of course, the supper hour here on the west coast of Canada, and usually it would be much busier here, but probably only about a dozen cars waiting to get into both the United States and Canada. Peter?
Ian, we've heard about the Code 1 alert on the American side of the border. What is the situation in terms of security on the Canadian side right now?
Well, many of our viewers are used to coming to the border crossings, coming back into Canada, and often simply being asked, are you Canadian, and being let through. A much different story tonight as cars approach the border crossing on the Canadian side. First of all, there's an immigration officer there. That's quite unusual. That officer is trying to verify identification. So for those who don't have passports, say they have driver's licenses, for example, the immigration officer often asks a couple of follow-up questions to try to verify that information. And then a gauntlet of customs officers are in the next lane, and we've seen as many as 3 or 4 going through glove compartments, trunks, and boxes in the back of pickup trucks. So at this hour, Peter, at least at this border crossing, it's much quieter and much more secure than usual. Peter?
All right, Ian, thanks very much. Ian Hanneman-Singh reporting to us from the BC-Washington state border. Well, we'll be joining more coverage in just a moment. never back. The global reaction to the death and destruction was swift. Almost every world leader lined up behind the U.S. to condemn the attacks. And as Don Murray reports, they were also bracing for trouble of their own.
The world watched transfixed. This was London. It could have been any major city in Europe this afternoon. Television pictures gathered crowds. They evoked curiosity, disbelief, and then horror. Traders were moved from the London Stock Exchange. They too watched the televised pictures in disbelief. Some left one of London's main financial office buildings. American firms sent their workers home. Rapidly, police forces around the continent were put on alert. Security was noticeably heavier at the American embassy in London. By the end of the afternoon, the impact was most obvious at airports. London's Heathrow was filled with passengers whose planes, headed for the U.S., had been turned back in the air. The chorus of condemnation from European political leaders was swift and unanimous. Germany's Chancellor Gerhard Schröder talked of the revulsion his government and his country felt at these attacks. Russian President Vladimir Putin described the attacks as an evil blow against all civilized people.
И то, что произошло сегодня, лишний раз подчеркивает актуальность.
What happened today, he says, underlines the importance of Russia's proposal to unite all the forces of international society to fight terrorism. Britain's Prime Minister Tony Blair emerged from an emergency meeting of his senior ministers to say his country would stand shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. in a crusade to eliminate such attacks.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it.
This evening, NATO ambassadors met in Brussels just hours after all non-essential NATO employees had been sent home from the alliance's headquarters. Tomorrow, the European foreign ministers will meet in emergency session. But this furious round of diplomatic discussion barely conceals the obvious. No one in power on this side of the Atlantic has any real idea how this happened or what will happen next. Don Murray, CBC News, London.
Now from Europe to the Middle East, a region that's no stranger to suicide attacks. But the scope of today's events was shocking by any standards. Still, there were pockets of Palestinians who celebrated today's attacks. Joining us with the latest from the Middle East, the CBC's Neil McDonald. Neil.
Peter, the mood here in Jerusalem, and I think it's safe to say in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere in the Arab world, is a somber one. There's a feeling here of great foreboding. If, and I say if, these attacks were perpetrated by Arab extremists, then Israel is inevitably drawn into the equation, as are the Palestinians and other Arab states. For the past year, especially since the election of President Bush, Israel and the United States of America have become synonymous in the mind of the Arab street. To a great many Arabs, both countries are now bitter enemies. And that explains some of the scenes we saw here today. In Arab East Jerusalem, groups of people took to the street, celebrating, toasting Osama bin Laden, and generally hailing whomever managed to inflict such a lethal blow against Israel's closest ally and greatest protector. There were similar celebrations in the cities of the West Bank and in the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon. Most Arab leaders, though, understanding the sheer foolishness of taunting Americans at a time like this, were greatly restrained.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Palestinian extremist groups, though, issued cold denials and took the opportunity to lecture the United States. We are opposed to U.S. oppression, said this leader of Hamas, itself a group that has dispatched suicide bombers. We call upon the U.S. to take fair stands and not take Israel's side.
We deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples.
The terror attacks.
Israeli leaders universally expressed grief and condolences and declared a national day of mourning.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life.
This was not an attack just against America. It was an attack against civilization, an attempt to bring us back to a jungle where everybody will be full of fear.
On the popular Israeli political program, Popolitica, an Israeli general called for the immediate liquidation of Yasser Arafat.
What the American people
and from a former prime minister,
Israel. We here in Israel have been standing and fighting at the front line against terrorism for years. But now terrorism is struck at the heart of freedom. And this is exactly what this battle is. It's a battle between the forces of tyranny and terrorism and the forces of freedom and democracy.
And that, no doubt, is how the Arabs of the Middle East now fear the lines will be drawn, with them cast irretrievably as terrorists and the word Islam synonymous with atrocity in the Western mind. It's probably safe to say that most people here, Arab and Jew, now feel their lives have changed. And that the geopolitical lines here have shifted reality. Certainly, the current Palestinian intifada, the uprising, is going to be seen in quite a different light, beginning now. Peter?
Neil, at any time a major event has an impact on the Middle East, you have to weigh carefully the impact that it can have on either side in the historic dispute. There seems to be a sense that as awful as this is, the event that's happened in the United States today, that on the side of Israel expressing its shock and horror at what's happened, it almost seems that they feel that this can have an impact for them of a beneficial nature.
Well, Peter, you heard the sorrow and the sympathy that was expressed by Israeli leaders today, and it's genuine, but I think at the same time there is sort of a glimmer of grim satisfaction that the rest of the world has met Israel's enemy, and in a very sudden way. You know, and I think Israeli leaders are hoping that the world will close ranks with them. That's what they're asking for. I think to a certain extent that has begun. Simply the use of the word terrorism. Western news agencies and governments have been chary about using that word with regard to this conflict up to now, viewing it largely as a political construct. That's changed. The word terrorism is certainly on our style book now, and it's being used widely by Western news agencies, and I think just that is the start of the world's perception perhaps growing a little bit closer to Israel's about this sort of thing, and that will certainly be welcome to the leadership here.
All right, and underlining, as you have been throughout the day, I know it's early tomorrow morning in Jerusalem right now in terms of the time schedule here in this side of the Atlantic, but underlining, as you have all day, still no indication who was responsible for this, all kinds of fingers being pointed, but at this hour still no firm indication of who is responsible. Neil McDonald reporting to us tonight from Jerusalem. Now, more reaction from on the ground in the United States. Buffalo, New York is just a stone's throw from Ontario. Dan Bjarnason was in that city today. He saw people stunned, people outraged, and people desperate to help their neighbors.
In Buffalo, New York, as word of the catastrophe rippled across the city, security was tightened at many government centers, including City Hall, which shut down, and flags were lowered one by one. In the handful of shopping plazas that stayed open, there were few actual shoppers. Those few were mostly drawn to electronics stores, where they were glued to TV newscasts as the full horror grew by the hour.
It's been reported, our David Ensor has reported that
the Red Cross in Buffalo was holding blood donor clinics today, never dreaming the events in New York and Washington would become so relevant. As it turned out, this clinic was swamped. Tony Dell.
We had no way of planning for this kind of event or demand, and we didn't have adequate staff. We didn't have adequate beds. We were unprepared. But in less than 12 hours, we have beefed up everything and we're ready to collect and process an awful lot more blood.
By coincidence, an association of several hundred healthcare workers from all across the U.S. was at a convention in Buffalo. A delegation arrived at the donor clinic wanting to figure out how they could all give blood.
I came today to donate blood to help whoever I can. Because if this was me, if this was happening to me, I'd want people to help me, definitely.
This wasn't something you planned on doing.
Drawing blood today?
When you got up this morning, you thought, let's go give blood. That didn't happen.
No. I've never donated blood in my life.
Really?
Really.
And you're in the health field.
Right. I'd love to draw blood, but I don't like to give it. But I would.
So why is today special?
Because of everything that's happened. If they need our help, we're willing to give it.
Right now, everybody's kind of living in this movie that we don't know, okay, how's it going to end, that sort of thing. And we've all talked about that at different times today, how it feels very surreal. You don't feel like it's actually happening. And you don't know, is anything else going to happen or what's going to happen if it does.
For most here in Buffalo, the mood was not one of terror, but of rage.
If I could re-enlist, I would, because I'd like to get back at the person that took the innocent lives today for no reason at all. That's got me very upset.
Others counted themselves lucky they were here in Buffalo today and not in New York or Washington, although there was great empathy with those caught up in the cities at the center of the disasters.
My dad works there, so that was my main concern, to get in touch with him and see if he was still okay or alive. And after 3 hours, I was finally able to get in touch with him and found out that he was out to breakfast across the street when it happened. Luckily, thank God.
Danby Arneson, CBC News, Buffalo.
From Buffalo, let's take that live shot we've been showing you throughout the day. It's now night in New York City. The skyline of the island of Manhattan, dramatically different now, minus the twin towers of the World Trade Center. It looks like an eerie calm settling over New York tonight, but we can tell you that deep in the heart of the southern end of Manhattan, desperate rescue operations are underway. Trying to get near the area where the towers collapsed is still one of the biggest headaches, as firefighters, rescue operators, still trying to get rid of fires that are causing all sorts of problems and structurally unsound buildings that are on the verge of collapse in that immediate area. But we are starting to hear some incredible stories, reports indicating that there are people inside the rubble, trapped and alive, using cell phones to call relatives to say they are there, trapped inside the rubble. These kind of reports are at this moment sketchy, but it does offer hope, and the prayers that have been asked for by all who have been watching these stories throughout today for those who are still trapped inside the rubble. If some are alive, which now reports seem to indicate that is possible, our prayers are with them as rescue teams try to get to that scene, to get through the rubble and get to the people trapped inside. Horrific totals expected as the casualties will begin to mount when the rubble starts to clear. Remember, the twin towers of the World Trade Center house on a normal day anywhere between 20 to 50,000 people, 110 stories of offices, 2 towers. The questions of who carried out today's attacks and how burn fiercely in the minds of Americans tonight. But we do know that in the recent past, Canada has been used as a base for attempted terror attacks on the United States. The CBC's Terrence McKenna has been preparing a documentary on has this report for us tonight.
The most haunting foreshadowing of today's terror attack happened in Marseille, France in 1994. French commandos stormed an Air France jet which had been hijacked by Algerian Islamic militants. All the hijackers were killed. 159 hostages were freed. 7 had been killed. French authorities said the hijackers wanted to crash the plane fully loaded with fuel into Paris, if possible, into the Eiffel Tower. The trail from that case led French investigating magistrate Jean-Louis Bruguière to uncover a worldwide network of Islamic terrorists. His work has brought him to Canada and the United States.
This study is spreading over the world like a web.
So it's very difficult to grasp this new threat. But it's very, very dangerous because their target is very different. They try to target not only France, but America.
French investigators established links that led from the 1994 hijacking through the Paris subway bombs in 1995 and 96. And the trail eventually led them to a group of terrorists in Montreal, which included Ahmed Ressam, the man arrested at the American border with powerful explosives in the trunk of his car in 1999. Salim Jiwa covered the Ressam case for the Vancouver province.
Well, I see the Ressam situation as a precursor of what was to come. I see that as I mean, the astonishing part is what Ressam was saying was the number of people who are trained. For example, he stated that 60 people are ready and on standby in Italy. He named a number of groups in Sweden, number of people in Germany. So I saw that as a precursor. I was talking to a security source in the United States and just a month ago, and he indicated that the U.S. was very nervous still that something would happen and they would be unable to stop it. He said to me that these people are not going to stop, and you know it.
Ahmed Ressam easily obtained a false Canadian passport and used it to travel to the city of Peshawar in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. There he made contact with the Osama bin Laden organization and entered a terrorist training camp in nearby Afghanistan for months of instruction in bomb-making and assassination techniques. Islamic militants from many nations are trained in the Afghanistan camps. The bin Laden organization has been monitored for years by the U.S. security apparatus and the Situation Room at the White House. James Steinberg was Deputy National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration.
It's not simply a question of an individual belonging to one particular organization with one particular target, whether it's the GIA in Algeria or the Egyptian Islamic Jihad in Egypt, but rather a kind of loose network of people who have common affiliations, common training, common associations, frequently linked to Afghanistan, which becomes sort of a pool of individuals who may be available to be involved in terrorist operations elsewhere in the world.
The Ressam case has brought to light numerous connections between the Osama bin Laden organization and Canada.
Yes, indeed. There are other names, as you know, people who have direct telephonic links in Canada with Osama bin Laden's right-hand man, Abu Zubaydah. There are people like that in Calgary. There are people like that in Vancouver. There are people like that in Montreal. There are people like that in Toronto. Numerous telephonic links have been found with very sinister people and very dangerous people in Canada.
Suspected terrorists in Canada are monitored by the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, CSIS, and agents like Dan Lambert.
Counterterrorism is the main priority of the CSIS in terms of its mandate. We have 2/3 of our resources are dedicated to counterterrorism. We work extremely closely with the RCMP, with the Department of Justice, with CIC and Customs within Canada, as well as U.S. authorities. And in fact, I mean, we have liaison relationships with 130 different countries and over 250 different agencies.
What's valuable about the Ressam case is that it reinforces the necessity of this kind of cooperation. As you say, there were links in not only between individuals operating in the United States, individuals operating in Canada, but also in Europe. And as we began to uncover them, I think it reinforced among officials involved in law enforcement and intelligence the critical need for this kind of transnational cooperation.
Why would Islamic terrorists come to Canada? David Harris is former Chief of Strategic Planning at the Canadian Security and Intelligence Agency.
I think in terms of Islamic extremists in Canada, they regard the proximity of Canada to the U.S. as making Canada a kind of Islamic extremist aircraft carrier for the launching of major assaults against the U.S. mainland. And that's something we've got to remember.
Today's massive coordinated attack shows a level of sophistication well beyond what had been anticipated or predicted in the North American intelligence community. Most intelligence analysts thought a conspiracy of this magnitude would show up in the massive wiretapping and monitoring of suspected terrorists.
Indeed, this is a complete failure of intelligence. the United States, Canada, and allied intelligence services for a long time will be dissecting how such a major conspiracy that must have used the airwaves, may have used the internet as a contact point, could get through and be carried out without anybody waking up. This is havoc that has been created, and I suppose many heads will roll, and there will be lots of postmortems conducted on how such a major conspiracy could be concealed.
Congresswoman Jane Harman served on the U.S. Counterterrorism Intelligence Committee and has long pleaded for more resources to deal with international terrorism.
What is very worrisome is the goals of terrorists have changed. It used to be that terrorists would try to kill a few people and make a political point. But as we stated in this terrorism report that I worked on last year, the goal no longer is a seat at the table. The goal is to blow up the table.
Peter, there was a lot of finger-pointing at Canada after the Ahmed Rassam case, and it really led to a lot of concern about how easy it was for him to take advantage of the refugee and immigration rules in Canada, and there was a lot of pressure on Canada to tighten up. There's no indication that, you know, there's any connection between Canada and but
now let's go straight to the U.S. for a wrap of what's been
text messages. And that's because in 1991, when the law was enacted, that technology was not in widespread use. And that's exactly the issue. Does the Telephone Consumer Protection Act apply?
On airliners like this one. After Dateline's broadcast
right now is looking very closely at the subcontractors who were hired to clean the planes and who works for them. And the question that then has to be asked is, did they have to pass a security clearance? And that's a question that right now has not yet been answered.
Also, Peter, another way this is so sick is the use of commercial aircraft as flying bombs. You mentioned these are all transcontinental flights. That means they are loaded with tens of thousands of pounds worth of fuel. That means that when a commercial flight flies through the city of New York or near the Pentagon, which is adjacent to National Airport, it's not the same, it's not as menacing as the sight of, say, a military aircraft.
That's right. If you take a look at the approach patterns of both LaGuardia and Kennedy, especially LaGuardia, it comes right up the East River, right past the World Trade Towers. At Washington National or Reagan National, every pilot taking off is required to make an immediate right turn. And you know why, Brian, because if they don't, they're flying directly at the White House. So we may see the FAA issue some very new rules about exactly what now constitutes basically an approvable approach now.
Peter, tonight travelers across the country have very little choice amid all this sadness. There's the very real issue people are dealing with, and that is they are just held in place, this FAA term, a ground stop, a first in the nation's history.
It is the first, and by the way, I should caution everybody that the FAA announced when they did this that they would be reviewing this at noon tomorrow. They didn't necessarily say they were going to release it at noon tomorrow, and even if they did, remember, airlines operate because they have airplanes where they need to have them. They're not there tonight. A lot of planes were diverted to airports that some of these airlines don't even fly to. They've got to get those planes back. So it may take 2 to 3 to 4 days, even if they, release the hold tomorrow, for everybody to get back on track.
Peter, it's, again, amid this sadness, I feel I have to issue that caveat with each question, because that is the story in chief that we're dealing with. But we should talk about this coming when the nation can scarcely afford any further negative economic impact. What will this do to the national economy? I just read that item about gasoline price gouging. That's pretty disgusting. What will this do, this stoppage of transportation?
Well, you know, it's interesting. It's somewhat ironic in a way. It was quite thankful, and when you think about it, that all 4 of those planes today were less than half full. It was a statement of our economy to begin with. So it could even get worse. We're going to have to wait and see, because as one of your guests already said, this nation depends on our air traffic system. It's our economy. It's our communication system. So to a certain extent, we've got to get back up and running.
All of the pilots, you name it, you name an aspect of the flying business, everyone is idle. Shipping, goods, services. How about overnight shipping, something people have now come to depend on as a public utility?
That's right. When you ground all commercial flights, that includes UPS and FedEx. So this, I would hesitate to think that the FAA would keep this ground hold for much longer. The economic impact is too great. But what I will say is we're going to see the nature of security when it comes to air travel change forever. You may remember, Brian, that in 1991, during the Gulf War, they started a new perimeter security situation at most airports where you could only get to the airport if you were a ticketed passenger. No more meters and greeters. That was just to get to the airport, let alone the terminal.
And that will now change. Peter Greenberg, thank you very much for coming on. As always, let's go right now to the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, his second live press briefing of the day.
We can to support the efforts of the people who are trying to recover people from the debris and the horror that's taken place down there. The number to call if you have questions. I'm not sure we can answer all of your questions, but at least we can try to answer it, is 1-212-560-2730. That's 1-212-560-2730. If you have questions throughout the night and tomorrow, that's the number to call rather than 911, which you should just call if there is an emergency. We had over 1,100 emergency room visits today that we know of. So far, we have 6 fatalities that we know of, 5 at St. Vincent's. Obviously and tragically, there are going to be a lot more than that, but that's what we know of at this point. We had over 300 patients that were treated at St. Vincent's, over 160 at Bellevue, 250 at Beekman Downtown Hospital. And the hospital, these hospitals were probably the ones under the most stress, but they were able to get through. I want to thank all the people that helped St. Vincent's getting the water that they needed and the support that they needed. Also, I'd like to say to people that might consider doing this that services should be made available in New York City tomorrow on a fair and equitable basis. Anybody that thinks that they're going to gouge consumers or ask for extra amounts of money for food or anything else, we're going to have the police and the Consumer Affairs Department out there. So just be careful. This is a time in which we all have to cooperate and help each other. Alternate side street parking is suspended. Sanitation services will take place in most of the city, except obviously in the lower part of Manhattan, where the sanitation department will be working to remove debris, which has already started. And the schools, again, will be closed tomorrow. And hopefully we'll get them open as soon as possible. Tomorrow the effort will be at trying to recover as many people as possible and trying to clean up the horrible mess that was created by all of this. And I would ask people to cooperate as much as possible in that effort. If you have to come into Manhattan because your business is essential, then obviously do it. The upper part of Manhattan will be open. But if tomorrow is a day in which you want to stay home and stay with your family and give comfort and support maybe to other people that have been affected by this, it would be a good day to do that. Yep, the point that Richie Shearer makes is people are wonderful, and I mean this in the best sense of the word. We've had thousands and thousands of people that have come to help us. When I was down at the site near the World Trade Center, I met a lot of the National Guard's people that the governor has sent, really wonderful young men and women. We have enough volunteers now. You know, we have more volunteers, frankly, than we need at this point. And what we need to do is to focus the efforts of the professionals that are there in being able to do the recovery and try to save as many lives as we can and restore services as quickly as possible. We may be asking for more volunteers tomorrow and the next day and the day after, but right now we don't need any more volunteers.
Mr. Mayor, is there still hope that there are people who are
Yes.
still alive and well?
Yes, there's hope. There's hope that there are people that are still alive.
How is the rescue effort hampered by the darkness? What do you do?
We moved a lot of lights in so that the area is being lit now, so that I don't think the rescue effort is going to be hampered by the darkness. The rescue effort is hampered by the fact that there's still fire there, there is still unsound
Mayor Giuliani in the city of New York tonight, crippled as you watch our continuing live NBC News coverage of this attack today on targets in and the people of the United States.
Today we've had a national tragedy.
I've never seen anything like it. It literally blew itself into World Trade Center.
Just a short time ago, saw the tail end of a large airliner plunge into the Pentagon.
I was in the building because I was driving a friend. So I'm worried for her safety.
The World Trade Center is no more.
Our coverage continues tonight. There you see Lower Manhattan, absent the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The side streets lit only by the searchlights, assisting in the search and rescue operation tonight. The dust, the plume of smoke and debris still visible in the skies over Lower Manhattan. Here is the very latest. Thousands are feared dead in today's attacks. The destruction of the World Trade Center, the attack on the Pentagon. 266 people were aboard the aircraft alone that were down today. Death toll too high to calculate so far. Doctors are still needed in the city of New York. An all call has gone out. Phone numbers have been posted. Local news will be carrying them tonight for all physicians, health professionals, nurses who are available. The president tonight said not only will justice be done, quote, we will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. It's that one sentence in his 5 or so minute speech that has received so much of the attention tonight. And as we learned and warned throughout the day as our live coverage continued, people were girding, those who were not immediately worried about loved ones in these attacks, girding for perhaps prominent Americans who were on either the aircraft or killed in the Trade Center or on the ground at the Pentagon. The NBC television community saddened this evening with word from the Associated Press that among the passengers on American Airlines Flight 11, Boston to LAX, was David Angle, age 54, Pasadena, California, executive producer of NBC's hit series Frasier. Also, we learned earlier today that television legal commentator Barbara Olson was on the American Airlines Flight 77 from Dulles to Los Angeles. Neither flight, of course, arrived at the destination. Both were used in this attack today. Barbara Olson also is the wife of Ted Olson, the U.S. Solicitor General. She became certainly well known during the impeachment fracas in this country and was a frequent guest on our evening newscast and other networks. So many people across this country on this wrenchingly sad day dealing with their own family and personal tragedies tonight. The scene where so much of it is unraveling is in Lower Manhattan. NBC News correspondent Ann Thompson was there, not far from where the initial plane came into the first tower, and is with us tonight with one of the rescue workers. Ann?
Brian, I am here with Sergeant Ralph Lowe. Normally he works narcotics. Tonight he is working rescue. Sergeant Lowe, you've spent the last 11 hours back there, down there. Within 15 minutes you just walked out. Can you tell us what's going down, what's happening at the scene?
Right now they're just coordinating the rescue effort. They're trying to get all the people, whoever's still left alive out there.
Are they finding anyone alive?
Yes, they just, as far as I know, they just found a couple of police officers unconscious at the base of what used to be the towers.
What about the dead? I understand they've set up a temporary morgue down there.
Yes, down at Vesey and West Street, they have a temporary morgue, and they're, reclaiming as many bodies as they can out on the perimeter.
Talking to some of the people who've come out tonight, they said one of the problems has been is that the fires continue to burn and they've had trouble trying to get in there to do any kind of rescue effort. What have you seen? Do they have those fires under control now?
I think now the fire department has them under control or out at this time, but it's still red hot, and that's hampering the rescue effort.
Is it organized down there? Is it a sense of chaos? Because I understand that there have been a lot of firefighters lost tonight, so the losses are it's not only the magnitude, but they're also personal.
Yes, everybody's deeply upset. It's a horrific thing. But we were down earlier, down with the firemen, down at the scene when the building 7 collapsed, and you know, they're just trying to, you know, pour water on it and put it out from a distance. But now they're trying to get in there and see if anybody's left alive in the rubble.
Mm-hmm. Your thoughts as you walked out tonight?
I tell you, I don't even know what to say. Just pray for the families, and there's thousands of people dead. It's horrific.
Sergeant Ralph Lowe, thank you very much. You've been very patient. Thank you. Brian, throughout the night, we have seen ambulances from as far away as Passaic County, New Jersey, fire trucks and ambulances from Norwalk, Connecticut, from the far reaches of Long Island come down here to try to go in there and to try to do any kind of rescue effort. Throughout the night, we have also seen trucks with lights, big lights, to light up the area so they can continue to work through the night. We've also seen busloads of more New York firefighters go through, but they have suffered a tremendous loss tonight. As you know, one estimate, 200 firefighters died today, 200 firefighters from New York City. One of them, their fire chaplain, a Franciscan priest who worked in the area, who presided over many funerals of firefighters killed in action. Now his fellow priests are considering tonight how they will lay him to rest. Brian?
Ann Thompson, thank you. Much of that apparatus appears like it's coming off the surface of the moon. It is an incredible backdrop there in Lower Manhattan. Tonight, Ann was there throughout the day. We mentioned she was in the area for the initial crash, as was our good friend and CNBC anchor Ron Insana, who was interviewed today immediately following the blast and stayed with the story. And Ron, let's begin with that and your story before we get anywhere near the actual business of the markets, which you usually cover. And we'll start with that. How are you, buddy?
Well, fortunately, I'm doing quite well. Thank you for asking, Brian. It was a harrowing experience. I was actually en route to the Trade Center after having learned about the planes flying into the two buildings. I was at a business breakfast in Midtown Manhattan, and I got down there, I would say, probably in the neighborhood of 9:30 or so. Actually met up with an MSNBC cameraman on the street, and we were attempting to work our way from the east side of the World Trade Center to the west side, where we knew some colleagues and trucks and correspondents would be stationed. And as we moved toward the building, and I suspect we were within, I would imagine, 1.5 to 2 blocks of the Trade Center to the east and 1 or 2 blocks south, we looked up and the big building began to blow out from the top. And we turned and ran as the debris began falling, Brian. And John, the cameraman from NBC, who went straight down the street. I made a right, hoping that this cloud that was following us down the street would be stopped by the buildings that would be adjacent to me. That was not the case. It was a scene out of Independence Day where these huge black clouds filled the streets until the air around me was totally black. I ducked behind a car, and as the debris continued to fall, reached up to see if the car was unlocked. It was, and I got in. I could not see outside the car for several minutes as small amounts of light began to work through the blackness. I made it into a building that was in front of the car, where there were a couple of policemen and some others who either worked there or were taking refuge there. And we eventually made our way to a police truck and began the trek back to Midtown Manhattan.
And Ron, you became one of the many stories walking around the city, and unlike most people who had cell phones that were useless, were looking for a phone, at least your wife Melinda could see you on television to know you were okay. A lot of people didn't have that luxury.
I did manage to get a hold of her on the telephone as I was working my way up Midtown. Once I got out of the police truck at about 34th Street and 2nd Avenue, there was a moment where I was able to make a successful phone call. Now, my family back in Los Angeles learned of my predicament after 3 hours of wondering as I got on the set with Tom Brokaw and Matt Lauer and Katie Couric. fortunately, they realized I was all right despite the concern over my appearance at the time, where I was covered completely in debris.
You and everybody else down in Lower Manhattan. Now, Ron, let's talk about the business side. Markets closed tomorrow. Banks open. Things like ATMs, infrastructure, everything else up and running?
As far as we know, I mean, certainly in the surrounding area, that is not the case. What was hit today, and we talked about this earlier, Tim Russert was talking about how this attack was designed to have maximum impact, both in terms of the political consequences and in terms of loss of life, which is the greatest tragedy of all. It was also designed to have an immense financial impact, at least in the short run. The World Trade Center is, in many ways, the nerve center of the financial community in Lower Manhattan. There are brokerage firms, Morgan Stanley, the biggest tenant in the two buildings. There are other smaller brokerage firms. There was one exchange which trades gold and silver, traded gold and silver, also housed there. And so many other Wall Street processes are taken care of in the World Trade Center and also in 7 World Trade Center, where, of course, some regulatory staff were housed as well. Those people mercifully are safe, but the building is gone. So the question about how trades settle and are cleared, questions about financial transactions and the wiring of money are still open. The U.S. government is suggesting that the settlement process or the mechanics of the market will work fine. The Federal Reserve saying it will provide enough money to keep the system stable. All that being said, today, we should point out, though, overseas markets are down rather hard, Brian. At one time, the Nikkei in Japan was down in excess of 6%, falling below the level of the Dow this evening for the first time since 1957. So we see at the moment about